Guillermo del Toro's 2006 movie Pan's Labyrinth is a cinematic wonder and a movie of parallels. Del Toro combines folk tales and fantasies with gruesome historical events. Set in 1944 in Spain and after the Spanish Civil War, our main protagonist, Ophelia, and her pregnant mother go to live with her new stepfather, Captain Vidal, in the Spanish countryside. Ophelia's new and hostile stepfather is responsible for exterminating the rest of the anti-fascist rebels that are hiding in the hills. 11-year-old Ophelia is extremely close to the barbarous war and the horrendous violence that takes place around her. And on top of that, her mother's tough pregnancy is very challenging for her. So, how can a child in love with fairy tales cope with this situation? She creates one for herself. Folk tales have been known to help children better understand the harsh realities of the world. Why do I use folk tales instead of fairy tales? Because fairy tales always have happy endings and are very sugar-coated, like Snow White or Cinderella, whereas folk tales don't always have happy endings and can be very morbid, exactly like Pan's Labyrinth. Even though Ophelia's fantasy world might seem completely different from the actual world she lives in, we can see elements of what is happening around her in the fantasy world. For example, in the Pale Man scene, we see the monstrous child-eating Pale Man sitting at the head of the table, and there's a great deal of fruits and delicious assortment of food, and when Ophelia eats a grape from his food, the Pale Man brutally bites the fairies' heads off and tries to capture Ophelia. Similarly, we see Vidal in the dinner scene sitting at the head of the table that is filled with a variety of food and is speaking of killing all the rebels no matter what it takes. Del Toro uses camera and editing techniques to make the transition between the fantasy world and the real world seem as fluent as possible. For example, he uses trees or walls for wipe cuts, which give the illusion that the fantasy world is just as real as the actual one. The acclaimed director once said about his movie that it's about authority and rebellion. We can see this in both storylines. The first and more obvious one is the rebels against Captain Vidal and the new Spanish government. On the other hand, Mercedes, the maid in Captain Vidal's house, who's helping the rebels and giving them information. Likewise, the doctor that seems to be in alliance with Captain Vidal and helps his pregnant wife, but on the other hand is actually helping the wounded rebels. But the second act of rebellion is more complex, because Ophelia is rebelling against more than one authority. There's Captain Vidal, there's her mother, and also the faun that tells her what tasks to complete if she wants to become the princess of the underworld. Ophelia disobeys the faun in 2 out of 3 tasks. The first is when he tells her not to eat anything from the Pale Man's food, and the second is where she refuses to shed her newborn brother's blood. In one crucial scene towards the end of the movie, we see both worlds collide. Ophelia is standing in between Captain Vidal and the faun, and both are trying to take her brother away from her. But she refuses to listen to either of them. Instead, she sacrifices her own life and is shot by Vidal. But eventually she is reunited with her family in the fantasy world, and in the closing narration, we hear that Ophelia reigned for centuries in the underworld. Back to the real world, Captain Vidal shoots Ophelia to take his son from her, and when he comes out of the labyrinth, he is faced with Mercedes and the rebels. We see Captain Vidal giving his son to the rebels and asking them to tell his son about the time of his death and about him. But Mercedes responds, "He won't even know your name." And we can see a flash of hurt in Vidal's eyes before he is shot. To dive further into Vidal's personality, he's a merciless fascist who wants his son to be born in a new, clean Spain. Nothing matters to him other than killing the rebels and the health of his son. And Ophelia's mother, his new wife, is nothing to him but a surrogate for his child. Vidal carries with him his father's pocket watch everywhere. From a brief story at the dinner scene, we understand that Captain Vidal's father was also an army man, and when he was dying in war, he smashes his pocket watch so that his son would know the time of his death, which explains why Vidal would want his own son to know what time he died too. We see Vidal fixing the gears of the watch in one scene and staring at it in another, when he is in battle with the rebels. Vidal is obsessed with continuing his father's legacy, and he believes his son will do the same for him. Vidal is not only the antagonist in Ophelia's story, but he's a representative of fascism. Del Toro wants to show us how cold and appalling the fascists were. And how does he do that? By never pulling the camera away from violence and showing us every bloody detail, like when he smashes a man's face with a wine bottle, or tortures a rebel. Even though the anti-fascists didn't succeed in their plan, at the end of Pan's Labyrinth, and with the death of Vidal and the rescuing of the innocent baby by the rebels, we feel as if they actually won, which is parallel to Ophelia's story. Because even though she got shot and killed by Vidal, in the last scene we hear that she reigned in the underworld, and we also see a flower bloom on the branch of the tree she had gone into, which gives us a feeling of eternality. Here we can assume that Del Toro is saying, even though the rebels didn't actually win against the Spanish new government, they are forever eternal.